We'll now move on to our next speaker in our research culture strand. Dr. Sam Oakley from the University of Glasgow will be talking to us about how to inculcate and support a healthy research culture through the means of training and supervision. Sam has been a member of Research and Innovation Services at Glasgow, and her role is focused on ensuring researchers have the appropriate training, resources and support to develop their own research capacity, so empowering them to do the best research they can. And this can include a variety of means through training and support and various programs at Glasgow, which there's an awful lot of work on research culture, as previous attendees of our previous events will know. Also a bit biased here, it's great to see another archaeologist on the program. So Sam, welcome aboard. The floor is yours. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, James. Right, I'll just share my screen. I should say that I have the dreaded internet is unstable message appearing occasionally, so I'm hoping that this will be all right. So can you see my slides, James?
That's come through just fine.
Fabulous. And I'm going to stop my video just to make sure that I'm not using up unnecessary bandwidth there. So I'll turn it back on at the end. Thank you. Right. So thank you very much indeed for giving me this platform today. It feels such an honor. I want to use my time to speak really about how we create a culture to support research integrity with a real focus on the role of the doctoral supervisor. So they work within a research culture that helps or hinders them. They also create that culture for others. And I think probably some of what I say will be relevant to the wider concept of supervision of early career researchers, perhaps by PIs, but I will be speaking specifically about postgraduate researchers, or PGRs as I'll call them. So as James said, I'm based in research and development. I work at the intersection of promoting and supporting research integrity. And also I am involved sort of to the side with our research misconduct process. So I'm kind of bringing you today what I observe and learn from that.
That wasn't a good start, but it got worse.
Sorry, James, I don't know if you can, I can hear somebody else talking if they can mute.
It seemed to go offline. I had to restart.
I'm just going to carry on. So today, what I'm going to be drawing from primarily is the reflections of our researchers. So I'm really it's really fortunate. Our research integrity training is online, it's purely online, and it's reflective. So we get a set of short responses from every researcher who does that. So as well as reading and responding to those, what I can do also is synthesize and study those reflections to help us build our support and our understanding of what researchers need to improve research integrity actually on the ground in a very practical sense. And for today, I look back specifically at what people have said about supervision. So that's really where I'm coming from. And I'm really sort of foregrounding care for supervisors. I think that's really, I mean, not saying we shouldn't care about the PGRs, but today I'm foregrounding the supervisors. And I think it's very clear to me how much supervisors worry about the expectations upon them, generally, but also specifically about research integrity. And I think this has been made worse by the pandemic, certainly. We tend to regard supervisors as role models. I sort of observe this, it seems to spread through policy and literature on research integrity. I find that quite simplistic. I find it quite a risky view. I don't think we can just label them that and then walk away. So my question for today is, how do we support doctoral supervisors to promote, teach, and embody research integrity? So that I think it's primarily institutions, but it's also sort of perhaps relevant more widely to the whole ecosystem of research. And of course, I'm going to state the obvious. I don't need to tell you, supervisors is a huge, diverse crowd of extremely clever people. So of course, you've got those subject differences, And I think it's really worth reiterating, the language and the content of research integrity can really alienate people if it fails to fit their discipline. I found in my training, you just have to keep stepping further and further back and being really careful about the vocabulary to keep it broad enough and to make sure that that discourse works for everybody. And I think we all benefit from that. I don't think that's a problem. I think it's really good to make some people aware that some researchers are aiming for subjectivity. We're not all trying to be objective. We have real, specialist corners like creative practice. Pure mathematicians have their own wonderful view on all of this. So everybody brings their own perspective, and I think it's all the better for that. But also that diversity. Are the supervisors, some of them are more experienced than others, some of them are more engaged than others, some of them are more biddable than others. And also, I think really important to note, not all of them will have had a good experience themselves. So we had a recent workshop. We asked the room and we said, was your supervisor a role model for research integrity? And only really half of them said yes. And some of them had some real, bad experiences. So supervisors are certainly not all learning from good examples that they might have had. So what unites them as a crowd? So apart from the job and the structure that an organization puts around that role, I think my observations as a trainer would be that what unites them is a shared experience of a culture of overwork, pressure, a sense that the system is working against them, not for them, particularly for this particular task of promoting and supporting research integrity. This comes loud and clear from the responses to the training. You don't need me to tell you this. We've had that wonderful report from Wellcome on research culture. And they flagged it right there. And they said, while there were some examples of poor behavior by principal investigators and other supervisors, these were in the minority. Most respondents saw their supervisor as decent and trying their best, but constrained by a system that rewarded outputs and money over individuals. So I want to acknowledge this, and I want to register this as absolutely a major issue. But I'm not going to focus on systemic issues for the rest of this talk, really. I'm going to focus on what we can do at a more institutional, practical level. So my main question about how we support supervisors, I want to expand it into 3 further questions, and then I'll talk about each of these in turn. So first of all, do we recognise the complexity of the supervisor's role for research integrity? To what extent can training help? And to what extent can improving research culture help? So we're thinking about the complexity of the role that they have. I think until we really understand all the nuances of this, we're not going to do our job supporting them with research integrity. And I think there is a recognition that the current model that we have has issues. So again, this is from the UKRI Research Integrity Landscape Study, which says that a common model assumes that supervisors will instruct their researchers in research integrity. In many cases, however, supervisors are not trained themselves and may not feel recognised for providing this instruction. So I'd like to point out as well that even that simple statement, supervisors will instruct their researchers in research integrity, I mean, it gives me pause. What does that actually mean? Now, I know I've seen already, I know my colleague Emily Woolen from Edinburgh is on the call, and I'm possibly Catherine Winchester from the Beatsons here too. They will recognise this. We had a go at mind mapping what we thought research integrity training should include. And I know you can't read that. And that's because it was such a giant mind map that it's not even possible to put it on the screen. So the point I'm making really is that research integrity is a vast, sprawling, poorly defined curriculum, if you like. So even expecting one supervisor or even a group of them to encompass all of this is a huge ask. And also, it implies really what we're asking or trusting them to do is to pick and choose which bits of that giant map they might want to speak about. So I think, that's not helpful. So if I think about the role of the supervisor, I kind of, based on what I've seen and observed, this is how I would interpret perhaps how they see themselves in a way. Yes, they do have a role as a guardian for research integrity, that idea of somebody who is staying vigilant, who is spotting issues, who's giving guidance to correct the PGRs. Now, I think we very clearly do not make them officially responsible if a PGR has a misconduct issue. But certainly in other parts of the world, this does happen. At an extreme, they might get sacked. And supervisors may well come from cultures that have a different attitude to their responsibility, or to the formal responsibility. But I think even here, if your student does get into a misconduct incident, which is rare, but it does happen, the supervisor will be involved. Questions will be asked. Why wasn't something spotted? What guidance did your student get? What training did they complete their training? All these kind of questions will come up. And you can factor into that situation tension about perhaps tension within supervisory teams, or power imbalances, or other vulnerabilities. And you can see how incredibly stressful that can be for supervisors. And I think anyone who has experienced that becomes a real advocate for being much more proactive about preventing issues occurring, and and what they do in their own supervisory practice to sort of cover their backs. I also think at an extreme, some supervisors can become victims of unreasonable PGR expectations or misconceptions. I think authorship disputes often wander into this territory, and that can be very, very difficult to untangle. And this often, this obviously relates to how the supervisor has set expectations, kept them flexible in changing circumstances, and perhaps is able to have difficult conversations or not. I did notice that when Sweden set up their new national misconduct agency, which I think quite quickly got swamped, many cases referred to the agency, they said, were the result of personal disputes, particularly between PhD students and their supervisors. So, there is a lot of, that can be quite a confused space, I think. And of course, we do have at the other extreme, some supervisors may be to blame, the villains. Not many, but there are bad authorship decisions, unrealistic expectations, sacrificing quality for speed or quantity. And again, that Wellcome Research Culture Report said that 1 in 5 junior researchers and students have felt pressured by their supervisor to produce a particular result. So that does exist. And then, of course, the role model, the mentor, the teacher, doing it all right, showing how it should be done, the Jedi Master training their young Padawans. That's the sort of the model that I think perhaps we tend to sort of associate with most readily. But this is what I'm sort of feel quite strongly. This is what we should do. We should support supervisors explicitly with the risks and challenges of research integrity, as well as placing our high expectations on them. So obviously policy has a role here. And I think how we frame that, how we frame their work at an institutional level is really important. So at the University of Glasgow, we have the PGR Code of Practice, and I think that does an amazing job. You might have something similar of separating out really clearly whose responsibility different aspects are. And it's very clear that the PGR themselves is responsible for their own research integrity. We also have a code of good practice in research, and that makes clear that the supervisors and the PIs, their role is to create that environment, to create a research environment of mutual cooperation, we call it. What I'm not so sure is whether the policies make it clear where the boundaries of the supervisor role are. And we've got amazing support in place at Glasgow. I think we're lucky, it's well resourced. We've got research integrity champions and advisors, a fabulous data management team, wellbeing support for PGRs, graduate schools. But I don't know if every supervisor is fully aware of how much they can draw upon other people, or how much they feel able to sort of push a problem to someone else. I'm not sure we've clearly defined that. I don't know. I'm not sure. I worry about that. And I also think, of course, the processes that we put around supervisors, do they help or hinder them? And particularly occasional processes. I'm not sure how well aware they are of things like the misconduct process, and that can feel quite daunting if you suddenly find yourself in it. So my point here is generally, I think if we want to engage supervisors deeper in promoting and supporting research integrity and that positive culture, the support for supervisors needs to be, perhaps more focused and a bit more engaged. And obviously one way to do this is potentially through training. So the question there, to what extent can training provide the answer? I think, obviously I'm a trainer, so I'm a little bit biased. I think it's part of the answer, but, it really has to be good training. It has to be training with a very clear sense of its role in a bigger picture and what it's going to achieve. And I think, I do think training needs somebody to care for it. I'm really lucky, Glasgow put the resource into creating my post. It's not all I do, but it's a big part of it. So, I'm there, I respond to the training to everybody who completes it, and, I'm listening and learning from it and improving it. But it does need to be integrated, I think, into the organisation, people, systems. So what I thought I would do is just quickly tell you where we are at the moment. And I still think of this as a work in progress, really. So this is kind of how we knit together research integrity training with supervision. So our PGRs, they all have to do research integrity training. They do it in their first year. And we're very clear now, this is really labelled introductory, it's a foundation. We make that very clear to them. We're not saying you do one bit of training and you're done. This is meant to be a start. What we try to do is to give them the big picture, sort of things that get covered, a simplified version of the things that get covered under research integrity. And what we want really is to activate them. So we want them to start thinking, what applies to me? What's most relevant to me in this? What do I need to talk to my supervisor about? So we're really priming them to go forward and have more conversations. So obviously, if we're doing that, we need to make sure that supervisors are ready for those conversations. So we do have, a program of staff integrity training. Within that, there's a really short module that's specifically on supervision. So the training has a big sort of general part to it, and then you can pick 3 things out of a selection that interest you to look at in more depth. And one of those is supervision. I've noticed that module is particularly popular, and it does seem to me that people are doing it not just who are supervisors, but who aspire to be supervisors as well. So what we do in that is we're telling them what we're telling their PGRs. I think that's really important, that supervisors know what the PGRs are being told. And we make it very explicit what the supervisors need to follow up on. And within that, we also suggest to them some ways they can promote research integrity, and also we advise on evidencing that support. So what I think we're trying to do really is activate both sides to get some activity going in this research integrity space. So what we say to them about what they need to follow up on is we sort of say to them, your PGR has had a general introduction. We need you, the supervisor, to give them more subject-specific advice. I think that's really important. What does good research look like in whatever area you're working? What are the questionable research practices for your subject area that your PGR needs to guard against? Now, they know those because that's in our training. One of the earlier questions that they reflect on is, what is the questionable research practices for your subject? So they do already have an idea in their heads about that. We also ask them to follow up on the local research culture. How can your PGR contribute and succeed in that environment? And also, really important, how do you show care and respect for everybody in that environment? And I think it's that equality, diversity, inclusion angle that's so important. So we're putting really well-being really at the forefront of when we're talking about research integrity. And I know we've got Rachel's talk later on. It's really good to see that that's being, brought into this space so clearly. I do have a checklist for supervisors. I'm not a big fan of checklists. And obviously, it's not meant to be a tick box, but I think they do appreciate having a set of prompts for planning discussions. And of course, you've got that excellent UK Rio checklist for researchers that can be used in this space as well. So that's telling them what they need to follow up on with their PGRs. We also suggest positive actions to support research integrity. So this is the list that we put up, and this isn't an order. This is just a suggestion of things that you might like to do. So things like having supportive, really important, occasional spot checks of whatever raw data or material the PGR is working with, just checking that they're producing it correctly, that whatever they're doing to it, they're doing it correctly, that everyone's understood the training and that it's all being done correctly. So just very occasionally having those spot checks. And I should say that the welcome report that did highlight, that research culture report highlighted that a quarter of junior researchers and students found that their supervisors didn't regularly review their work. So I think that, that is a valid point to make. Might be obvious, but there's no harm in restating it. Point 2 as well, just ensure that you have expressed the standards and expectations that you have around the quality of the work and make sure those are understood. Number 3, minimize stress. Just 2 words, but it's really important to make that connection between research integrity and the stress that people get under and then therefore make mistakes or fail to ask questions when they need to. Ensure training is completed and demonstrate that positive approach to compliance. So those are just suggestions. And we say to our supervisors, what would that look like in practice for you? So that's kind of positive actions that they can take or think about taking. We also talk to them about, their own peace of mind. So if you think back to the idea of they might become, a victim, they might become involved in a misconduct case. If they want peace of mind about that, I think most of these points are good practice anyway, but just ensure you keep a record of discussions if you have them, as well as you having closed discussions in, supervision meetings. If you can have those conversations in wider groups or disciplinary discussions around things like expectations and standards, that's great too. And also, making sure you track that really explicit support for training and required governance activities. And again, we ask our supervisors, what support do you need with that? There's lots of people that can help. And I think, like I say, a lot of this is just good supervision practice anyway, but we're really signposting strongly support and really just restating that all of this activity, it supports research integrity. So I have noticed this section of our training, and I think it's taken me longer to tell you about it than it would have done for you to actually do it because it's not very long. It gets a lot of appreciation. People like it. I think it's imposing order on this sort of big expectation. New supervisors say it's really useful for them to structure their activities. More experienced supervisors say it's a sort of reaffirm that they're doing the right thing. And they, sometimes people say, oh, I could do a bit better on that one aspect. So it's kind of just helping them reflect on their practice. And also really big relief from supervisors that we acknowledge well-being as an issue within this. So we do only require research integrity and supervisor training once every 4 to 5 years. So I think, that's a long time. I think if you think about the things we're talking about here today, sustainability, we've got Sam coming up talking about reproducibility and open practice. I think, even 4 years ago, would we have really emphasized those in supervisor practice? I'm not sure. Keeping supervisors up to date is really important. But above all, I'd say, I think all the work that we put into training is not going to pay back if we don't have that local support within the individual departments and teams. So really this links directly to culture. And this is the last part of what I'm going to talk about today. You probably, you don't need me to tell you about this again. Glasgow's done a lot of work on research culture. I think there was a talk on it last year. We're not alone in this now. There's a huge investment, isn't there, going into research culture, particularly I think Research England's made lots of money available for it. I've seen a lot of research culture posts being advertised. I think, it's big right now. This is how we've defined it at Glasgow. Colleagues are recognised and valued for their varied contributions to research. We support each other to succeed. We are supported to produce work that meets the highest standards of academic rigour. So obviously, it's really helpful to have this very high level, strong institutional signal that this is what matters. And this certainly, it shaped how I developed our research integrity training. But of course, culture happens at different levels. And really that microculture around the supervisor and their students is critical. The supervisor can't control that wider environment, but they can also make or break the experience for their PGRs. And unfortunately, some do prevent the bigger good intentions from reaching the students. And sometimes this will be completely unintentional. I think that most institutions, I'm sure, have plenty of people on the ground, roles and experts to support supervisors, which really, that is the culture, part of the research culture, the supervisors experience. So, as I said, at Glasgow, we've got the really strong graduate schools, research data team, integrity champions and advisors, the central integrity team. We've got the backs of the supervisors. There's always that challenge of comms. I think institutional communications is always difficult. And I often find that awareness of these sort of, support teams isn't as good as it could be, particularly our integrity champions and advisors. I mean, they're there to provide safe and supportive conversations. But if people aren't aware of that, that's a real missed opportunity. We've also developed a new supervisor community of practice. This has just started this year. So really moving away from the model of, mandatory training to a much better, wider peer support for supervisors. And generally across the board, there's much more mentoring activity happening at Glasgow, I think, and that's fabulous. Always that worry that the people who engage are the ones who are already engaged, and it's how do you reach the ones that aren't engaged? That's always the challenge there. So there's lots of resource going into culture, and it's also making sure that policy and communications fit that aspiration. But for me, I think, the number one issue in terms of culture and supporting research integrity really is workload and time. And I think this is where it's faltering most badly. This is, again, another quote from the Welcome report. They were speaking about how metrics and key performance indicators, KPIs, are often prioritized and little emphasis would be given to activities such as training or supervision for which there are insufficient structures in place to measure performance. It's always that thing of we measure the things perhaps that are easiest to measure. And obviously one of those is counting students who complete, how many doctoral students complete, but that tells us nothing about the experiences of anyone involved and the human cost, either on the PGR, the supervisor, or, or the wider culture. But how do we give people time? This is so difficult, but everything that people get excited about in terms of supporting research integrity, things like supportive peer review networks for research in progress, or, having time departmental meetings to discuss some of the questionable practices. There's so many good intentions. I think that people get inspired by ideas in the training, activities they could do. But these often, if these don't then happen, is that the fault of the training, or is it the culture, or is it just this workload model? Time and time again, it's emphasized as critical for research integrity and good supervision. So obviously I don't have an answer for that, but I think it's really important to say this, that, more time would help everyone do this stuff better. The only thing I am going to say on a practical level, and this is a really tiny, small scale solution, I think perhaps there could be more discipline specific activity on integrity topics, because this is things like conferences and networks, they happen anyway. And I think some of the questionable practices, people are quite excited about continuing those discussions. And perhaps one way to carve out a little space could be to integrate that more into these existing activities. And I think some disciplines are doing a fabulous job on this, psychology being a key example. So that's just like a tiny suggestion, not detracting from that major problem. So I'm going to finish now with 2 wish lists. So what I think, this is my entirely subjective opinion on this, what I think we need for this to work, if we want to really get supervisors working well for us in championing research integrity, I think we need to give them a manageable, sustainable role. I think that role needs to be part of a institutional and wider research integrity ecosystem, which has good support, good policies, and an interesting and integrated training program and timely targeted communications. It can be really easy to forget to communicate to our supervisors and remind them of all the stuff that's there to support them with this. And I haven't talked about this really at all today, but capturing that PGR voice and feeding that back into this process is also really important. And I do run the PGR sessions, so I can do that to some extent, but I think more work in that space would be really useful. And finally, I'm going to contradict everything that I've been saying about we shouldn't regard supervisors as role models. And I'm going to tell you what I think they can role model. So this is what I think they could role model and should role model. I think we need to see them showing that constant quest for quality. So interrogating their own current practice to try and find improvements. And I definitely include greater openness in that. I think that's really important. We want to see them embracing open research and all that that can bring. I think we want to see them showing how to have a really positive debate. If they can show humility and an open mind, that's creating that space where everyone feels comfortable to perhaps question themselves or what they've done, talk about mistakes, really important. I think if supervisors can show their PGRs, perhaps make this explicit, I'm sure they're doing this already, but how they're managing to even partly resist that pull to publish faster at the expense of quality and work harder at the expense of their own well-being. I'm not saying we expect supervisors to fully do that, but even small steps that they're making, that's really useful to share. And finally, I think that always actively promoting kindness, everything that the supervisors can do to create that supportive and inclusive culture is really, really essential for quality research. And I think, obviously there is a challenge in that. And I think managing PGR well-being is very difficult. But, there's never been more written about this. And there's so much good work going on at the moment. The Supervising PhDs blog, the Hidden Curriculum blog, I can share these links with you. There's certainly so much research out there to support them with this. So I think engaging with that is like so important. If they can carve out even just 5 minutes a week to read an article, that would be a really good start. So that is all I'm going to say on the subject. I've really just been making the case that a bit more thought into how we support supervisors can really pay back big time in terms of support institutionally for research integrity and for research culture. So I'm going to finish there. Thank you very much indeed for listening. You've got my Twitter handle if you want to take it. And now I believe I'm supposed to have questions with James now, so I shall stop my screen share.
Yes, that's right. We've had lots of questions come through and lots of interesting discussion in the chat as well. So thank you very much. We've had so many questions. I don't think we'll be getting through everyone, but Sam's thankfully made her Twitter available, and I'm sure we'll find other ways to follow up with her afterwards. Okay,
please pick the easy ones, James.
Easy ones. Okay. Right. Okay. Richie asks, how much do you feel that training can only be effective where the culture is one that openly recognizes how much kind of game theory there is in current models of publication, grants, income, reward, and recognition in academia? Do you feel training has to be realistic about the reality of the so-called publish or perish system?
Yes, definitely. And I think certainly, like say, I'm sure many institutions will have signed up, for example, to DORA and be championing responsible metrics on one level. But my goodness, the challenge of getting that, for example, to percolate down to, departmental level, I think that's really, really difficult. And obviously, even, our departments, they're working within their global research culture. So you have to strike a realistic note. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that in training. And what interests me is that gulf between, you've got the aspirational policy and the reality. So I think, certainly what I try and do, is really just push the things that can help on the ground. So for example, remind people we've got responsible metrics and remind them why. Also things like using the credit roles in the credit taxonomy for authorship. Just there are good things out there that you can push. And I think just helping people move forward, but being realistic, absolutely, that the bigger system is often still a very big challenge.
Thank you. Amelia asked, do you have any thoughts on the most effective form of communications to researchers? Is it videos? Is it newsletters? Is it presentations? If so, is it virtual? Is there a one very good way, or is it, or lots of different ways, the best ways to adopt?
Yeah, I think there's no easy way. We all want an easy way. There is no easy way. I think all we try and do really is try everything. I think definitely, don't waste their time. So you really honing your message is so important. And like, for example, in the training, it takes so long to whittle it down to be short. That's where the work goes in. And I think same with communications, have really targeted messages. I mean, we've started a blog, which we use to support our sessions. And I could share a link to that. We run sessions, but I think trying to get in at departmental level and getting, local advocates who will champion what you're trying to say as well, that's incredibly helpful. Trying to get into those departmental away days can be useful. And then, yes, occasionally sending out, central comms. If you can, it's not often, at Glasgow at the moment, I'm sure this is not atypical. It's not actually easy to contact all the supervisors in one go. Even that is a challenge. So I think you just have to try all the different options that you have, but always hone that message.
Thank you. So a very multifaceted approach. Gaynor asks, when you ask students if their supervisors were good role models for research integrity, had you defined what research integrity was so the students were giving an informed answer?
Sorry, I think that's a misunderstanding. I asked a room of supervisors if their supervisors were role models of research integrity. No, I hadn't, because actually I think part of that conversation was, what does that mean? What does that actually mean in practice? It's actually very hard to explain. For the students, for the PGRs, we do lay out in their training course what we're sort of talking about for research integrity, and it's slightly simplified, but it does give them a sense of the spread of the topic without overwhelming them. And again, that's not easy, as you probably know, James, from your work.
Absolutely. Jane asks, are you aware of any data or ongoing studies about whether training programs like this can be demonstrated to improve research quality after they've been implemented at their institutions? Or so in terms of the impact of your own work or in training in general? No. I can't imagine how you would show that, because I think the variables, like if you're looking at the end output of quality research, what would that mean? Would it mean you have fewer misconduct cases? But as it is, most institutions have very few of those anyway. I don't think that would measure it. What would it mean? I can't imagine how I would ever show that level. I could indeed do a program of work to evaluate my training, perhaps through assessing what people think of it and what they say they're going to do from it. I might even come back and ask them a year later to say, did you do those things that you were inspired to do? But as I said, I don't know, because if they've never, if they haven't, was it because they didn't have time? That's not my training's fault. I mean, I just find that such a difficult concept. I absolutely take the point that I'm not presenting to you graphs of this many people like my training and this many people.
I do get a huge amount of sort of qualitative feedback. So that's what I'm basing this on. But I really would love to hear if people have got ideas for doing that, because I find that a real challenge. I mean, obviously we evaluate it, but if I tell you that, like, 80% liked it, what does that mean? It doesn't mean they're going to
absolutely
better research.
No, it's fantastic. I would recommend you have a look in the chat afterwards, because there's some fantastic stuff in there. Okay, a couple of broader questions. Are your research integrity materials open access, RCM? I think, does that mean, are your training materials something that people can view online if they want to have a look at them?
They're not at the moment. I would really love to make them open access. I think obviously they're very much, full of Glasgow specifics.
Sure.
So it wouldn't be anything that somebody could just take and use off the shelf. As I think that's definitely something I'm working towards, particularly with the supervision module, which is really very short. I was hoping to make that available, but as you know, making things open takes time, and it's just having
Absolutely.
that space to do that. But I would love to do that, yes, absolutely. But I think, thinking about whether you've got the resource to support the training, that's the real challenge as well. I know for other places I've worked at, that's not always easy.
Thank you. Now, I'm afraid we've run out of time for questions. You've generated an awful lot of comments and discussion, Sam, and if you have time, I'd say have a look at the chat stream, because lots of interesting and thought-provoking comments and suggestions and ideas there, which you may find of interest. Thank you so much for your talk today. It was fascinating, and I know at UKREA will definitely, we talk to you quite a lot, and we'll definitely want to be talking to you more about this topic. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone.